dedicated educator, currently holds the position of Associate Professor at the University of Virginia School of Architecture, where she is also directing the school's urban design programs and is a visiting professor with the School of Cities. Khafif is the co-author of the award-winning publication Urban Build, Local Global, has published Stage Urbanism, and most recently co-edited Next New York. Dr. Khafif's expertise extends across multiple scales in both her writing and design endeavors, exploring temporal, typological, and collaborative strategies within urban design and architecture. Now, before I turn the presentation over to her, I'd like to remind everyone of just a few housekeeping items. First, you'll notice that all microphones are muted for the duration of the presentation. If you wish to ask a question live during the question and answer period, you can request to be unmuted and a staff member will assist you. You can use the chat feature to type in your questions or comments at any time, and they'll be collected and we'll get to as many questions as we can following the presentation. And last, just please practice respect and good etiquette. Anyone demonstrating inappropriate language or behavior will be removed from the session. Now, without any further ado, the exciting part, I'd like to hand over today's session to Dr. Khafif.
Thank you, Costa and Austin, Karen, Magda, and Noor. I'm very excited to be here today to present actually the first part of a two-part lecture engagement. As you mentioned, I'm a research fellow at the moment at the School of Cities. I'm very thankful for the opportunity. Toronto is a place that is very close to my heart, and I still consider myself a permanent resident of the city. I lived for many years there and also spent most of the summers back in Toronto, where we have an apartment downtown. So when I'm talking today, I'm talking as somebody who's an academic, a researcher, a designer, but also a resident of the city and who was very engaged in the neighborhood association together with Ken Greenberg. So I'm very excited to be here today. I entitled the lecture Designing Cultural Commons, and I want to maybe start or maybe address also the land acknowledgement that you presented in the beginning. I think it is very important that we acknowledge that when we are here in North America and elsewhere in the world also that we took land, and there are a lot of ways of how we can try to repair this. I'm not a politician, but I'm always asking myself what we can do as designers. And one of the most important aspects that I'm trying to call out in my teaching as well as in my practice and in my research is that we need to care for this land that used to be something else and that maybe wants to become something else. What you're seeing here is a picture of a parking lot, actually around the corner in Charlottesville, in front of a mall that closed many, many years ago. And since then, the parking lot sits there. We do not repair and give these lands back, but we see how nature is trying to work on these surfaces. So I find this a very compelling picture in relationship to land acknowledgement. When we travel back now to Toronto, I just generated this map over the weekend with my research assistant, where I looked at the amount of open spaces as well the amount of impermeable spaces using the latest data set from the open database of Toronto. And you can see here that the paved areas are continuously growing, and they are taking over the amount of open space that we actually have in the city. And you can see that the parking lot area, and this combines now the public as well as the private parking lots, is nearly a third of the surface that we are offering as open spaces. For me, a call for action, or at least to rethink what these surfaces can be or could be for the city. The work that I'm presenting today started many, many years ago. It is going to be the middle chapter of a book project that I'm working on. It's entitled On Urban Prototyping, the City One-to-One. And when we hear the term prototyping or urban prototyping, we very often refer back to what happened in San Francisco, 2012, the urban prototyping events that emerged, where communities, through engagement and open to everyone who can make proposals for the city how to improve the public realm, on a temporary basis. So we were locking down streets in San Francisco as well as in New York to test what the street could be without the traffic. So there are temporary notions, then they are the one-to-one testing it in the city as a lab. There is a notion of replication. How can we repeat specifically the smaller scale projects? And how we can do this all together through community engagement to also address stewardship and responsibilities in the city. This book is in the making. Some of the work that I'm showing today is intended to be in this book. There are multiple chapters. It consists out of interviews, out of case studies and precedents. It will start with the prototyping of the through temporality. It will also look at curatorial concepts, which brings me back to the research that I'm currently doing at the School of Cities. And also the last chapter will be dedicated to all the new forms of hybrid public spaces that we need in order to address climate change specifically. So I have three parts of this presentation. The first one is dedicated to what I call cultural placemaking, and actually goes back to my PhD thesis that I conducted many, many years ago. And that was dealing with cultural sites. All of them were located in Europe at the turn of the last century. In European capital cities, there was a lot of investment into culture and cultural programming through museums and galleries, etc., to activate and regenerate neighborhoods. And I was very interested to see that a lot, specifically later on, starting with the Centre Pompidou that had a huge plaza in front of it, that is also a part of the public space project, that the notion and the understanding of occupying these open spaces, sometimes really public and sometimes owned by the institutions, were a part of the programming strategies of the site. So I had a very in-depth analysis of 5 case studies, among them the Museumsquartier in Vienna, that went in the early 2000s through a paradigm shift. It was stigmatized. They called it the Vienna Vacui after the competition. That took a very long time. And then 3 or 4 years later, it became the Viennese living room. And I was very interested how that actually occurred through a multi-layered strategy. I'm listing here only the matrix space as a theoretical framework that understands the spatial production through the material artifacts, the social activities that take place in them, the organizational frameworks, as well as the perception and the memory of space that occurs in 3 scales: at the scale of the city, the neighborhood, or even the nation and the region. It starts with this, the city, the neighborhood, and also the scale of the human body. So this topic in itself is another lecture. I just want to create maybe a little bit a couple of contexts so that the analysis of the 3 precedents in Toronto may be understood through this framework. In the Museumsquartier, it was a 5-year programming strategy that actually activated a new form of urbanity. And the important part was that it's always felt extremely urban. And in this case, I want to say, you didn't identify necessarily sometimes if it was programmed, the activity, or if it actually was simply an appropriation of space of a neighbor, a community a group that lived next door to the Museumsquartier. So the idea of programming, but not over-programming, because a space needs to be simulated specifically when it changes its identity, but can't be permanently occupied. And how much is art, how much is leisure, how much is maybe even commercial? All of these aspects were a critical part of my analysis. I'm using now the word place branding. I know that is a red flag. It was also and is also for me a very red flag because we always connect commercial and a lot of instrumentalization through branding. But there are very interesting writings about how place management and also the activation of maybe former dormant or resilient spaces actually need the infusion of new activities so that the place and the space can create a new memory. And this needs to also be based on confirmation. So if you only have one event that programs art and culture and then it disappears for many years, this memory is lost again. So it is very interesting to see how curatorial practices are able to work with the idea of the mental map and how to change the identity towards an open space where everyone can participate and join in. So there are a couple of very interesting writings about this. At the end of my dissertation, I'm a designer and was considering, okay, if these are analytical frameworks to understand how specific cultural urbanism originated in these case studies, what would be the design strategy? And can I design the soft city, the programmed city, without maybe the investment first into a lot of architectural artifacts or a lot of capital investment? So that's where my work on the temporary city started. I was lucky, had a series of commissions by art festivals where I built temporary public spaces, and they were able to change the configuration to always support different kinds of programs. So I was very interested in the idea of designing spaces through the reorganization of the organizational framework and the activation, as well as maybe the capacity of these strategies to change the identity. At the bottom, you see a couple of these pictures. I also worked with West 8 on Team West 8 for the Fort Mason project, which is a birthplace of do-it-yourself urbanism, and where capital investment was something that would have really damaged the place in its identity. And gentrification, all of these questions came up, and we won the competition. And in this first phase, we really looked at how the place can be activated primarily through investment of programming and by strengthening the stakeholders that are already on site. So I want to talk about Toronto, and I'm presenting this work now as somebody who lives in Toronto as well. It started with a studio that I taught 2016 when I left for UVA, and a lot of my research that I conducted together with Maya Przebilski at the University of Waterloo and also at U of T was about the growth of the city, and then the challenges that the city is running into to provide the increased population with open spaces, with social infrastructure, with transportation, etc. I was very intrigued by city-owned land, because city-owned land is something the city can act on theoretically. I know there are different departments, etc., but theoretically there is a capacity of the city to act on this land. And I first ran it as a studio, then I collaborated with Michael Piper from U of T. We ran it as a seminar at U of T, and then I brought it back to UVA, got a grant, again worked with my students on it. So I have now 150 pages of edited material, but I will just today show a little bit of this. Maybe from 2016, we know that the downtown core area grows dramatically. What we see today, every time when I come home, there's somehow another tower that is erected, is not even the peak of the iceberg. So the projection of growth is still to come. We also know that most of this growth is, despite the avenue plan, is still occurring in condo development, which means on very small space, a lot of new people are moving into a neighborhood, and they all need open space. So it is actually, for me, less about access, which is a classic analysis of looking at open space and accessibility in a lateral way, where I craft a buffer around it and say, well, everyone in downtown actually can very quickly access a park. But it is very much about how many people are actually using these open spaces, and what does this mean for the population, specifically in the downtown area. Maybe as a side note, I mentioned earlier, I worked on multiple classes. I want to, at this moment, really thank my students who all contributed to this work. You will see the credits always as a line under the slides. I specifically want to call out Karim El-Arabi, as well as Darcy Engels and Christina Fischer, who helped me a lot to rework this material over the different years. When we look back, and that was an analysis done at U of T, there's a beautiful range, diverse range of open spaces. So theoretically, you can say Toronto is quite healthy when it comes to the public spaces that are offered. But on the right, you can see another analysis which ranks cities from out of our Montreal, Calgary, etc. And you can see that Toronto is actually ranked lowest in the case what it means to offer public spaces to its population, also due to its high population density. And then when you go back once more to Toronto, you will see that some wards are able to offer a lot of open spaces. They are close to the ravine system. They are maybe more in the outskirts where you have lower population density. And then in the downtown areas, you have neighborhoods where the per person public space actually goes down to 4 square meters. In addition, as a lot of development happens in the downtown core areas of Toronto, there are actually funds that come through the development fees, but cities are, or the city is, according at least to Parks in Crisis, maybe not able to actually spend these funds in the downtown areas because there is not so much space available.
I think, Mona, you just got muted.
Is it okay? Can you hear me again? Perfect.
Yes.
I don't know if I did this myself, sorry. So over the years, I looked at what the city is trying to do, and there are great ideas. The city actually tries to buy even private parking lots. It tries to work on the rail deck park. We know that this comes with challenges. I don't want to go into details, but it's also the Bentway, for sure, that was initiated during this time that now offers huge amounts of open spaces to the downtown neighborhoods. So there's a lot in the making, but again, ownership of land is key. I would say the city might get into the problem of running out of land because the city can't officially compete with developers to buy this land by law. So this is certainly a challenge. So there was also the Downtown Parks and Public Realm Plan that was created with amazing work done by Public Work, and I think also Jan Gehl was involved with a study and interviews of users. And you can see that there are a lot of figures that are emerging that are really fantastic amateur for the city. I am very much intrigued, going back to my book project and the city one-to-one, I'm very intrigued by the small scale public space and how we can grow these public spaces or maybe convert underutilized spaces to become places that are shared among neighbors, that are also maintained maybe through neighborhood associations, etc. In this report, it was the local places, and they were specifically looking at the laneways, and we know now the laneway zoning code also changes to add housing. So there are competing interests, obviously, but maybe to bring this once more back to my book project, I'm very much interested in the mist that lives in the city, the smaller opportunities, because I believe we can design these spaces more easily together. They probably also have less capital investment, and they can happen simultaneously, which means the field of the city could change much faster. There are cities who are doing this. When we look at New York, for example, after the Broadway was shut down and then also dedicated to more public spaces through Jan Gehl, also the Plaza program was initiated, which is all about shrinking the paved footprint in the city. And today, the city can look back as a lot of open spaces that had been developed. And I'm very fascinated, you know, communities can apply to get these grants, etc. And there is one ranking or objective, which is organizational maintenance capacity, which I find very interesting, which means the city also runs out of its capacity to actually maintain these open spaces. And I think Toronto is in the same situation. So we all depend then on volunteers or community associations to help with the maintenance of these spaces as well. So the small scale mist can be a big footprint if we start aggregating this. For example, this is just an analysis looking at the privately owned public spaces in Toronto that aggregated together becomes the scale of large park sites, Trinity Bellwoods. I'm also really want to honor Toronto for being the first North American city that came up with a bylaw for green roofs for new development, which is a tremendously big footprint that for sure addresses heat island effects of cities. So that will be absolutely key in the future. But for sure, if we can now access these open spaces on the rooftop, then they can also serve as public spaces. So how much could these projects be improved? And I think the city has its own precedents. I remember when I had my first meeting with Ilana in the Bentway studio, we were sitting in the community center that had a roof that also operates as an open space with running tracks, playgrounds, community garden, green roof that serves non-human lives. And we were looking down to the school courtyard and also discussed that the school courtyard is accessible during the non-school times. This is exactly the model that I believe we need probably more across the city. So my head always goes around how can we strengthen these strategies to accommodate other neighborhoods. So when I was working through these many years, I was obviously intrigued by the city-owned parking lots. There are many. I know that some of them are now dedicated to affordable housing projects, which is also an urgent need of the city. But again, the idea of how could these parking lots serve not only the function of parking, but through hybridization, either through physical, which means it's layered on top of each other, or through integrated time-based hybridization, how could these sites also serve other purposes? I had many CESA students who worked on Toronto when I was at Waterloo. This is Polly, who looked at all the residual spaces and how they could actually help the city to accommodate for open space access. Just to mention some of them. When I created the inventory of the city-owned parking lots, we did the first analysis, just created an inventory, seeing the different scales and locations, as well the footprint 6 times Trinity Val built this time. So it's a huge amount of open space that theoretically we could start using in different ways, at least in relationship to specific times. And I will get back to this later on, because obviously we also looked at the occupation of these sites, because these sites are generating income for the city, but they are also parking spaces, so people need to park somewhere. So there are conflicting interests, but I think it is worth looking into this potential. So it is not a Toronto-only problem. If I just go down in the United States, most of the downtown areas have tremendous amounts of open paved spaces. Not all of them are used, also because parking areas are very often used as a land banking strategy until the land can be now sold for development and has more value for the owner. So just a couple of sentences in relationship how we actually worked on this analysis. I did this framework, developed this framework with my SRA through a small grant that I received from UVA, where we created analytical lenses from population density, access to green space, public transit system, public institutions, location of neighborhood association, vulnerable communities, communities who are in need of public spaces, et cetera, et cetera. So there were all of these GIS layers. Then I created, on the right-hand side, typologies, where I said, well, how could we combine parking plus a forest? How could we combine parking plus a sponge? We also worked on a series of international precedents during this time. And on the middle, you can see all of the inventory with the little circles. And the circles was for us an approach to evaluate which sites should be pilot sites. Because if they were located in a neighborhood with high population density, with not a lot of public space around it, and access to public transit, and maybe next to a school, that became for us a priority site, or at least that's the assignment that I handed out to my students. And we called them out in these little game cards where we then dived a little bit deeper into the analysis of the sites. So I'm just showing you a couple of maps. I will do this very quickly. It's going to be a lot of visuals. That is a map that shows population density already, location of public parking lots, existing green spaces plus, and you can see this in these transparent bubbles, the pipeline projects, which means that is where population growth will occur in the very near future. So if we want to get ahead of the curve, we need to think about which spaces these new residents are using, also not only for their children, but also for their dogs, etc. So that was an important aspect. We also overlaid it with the open space plan of the city to see how these sites could strengthen the framework that was developed a while ago. We looked at, again, who are potential stakeholders. In this case, it was where are the public schools, and where are specifically the public schools who don't have outdoor gym spaces, for example, where they could use their own sites maybe to use these parking lots, for example, on the weekend when teachers are not looking for parking. We looked at demographics, income levels, immigration demographics, and again, always access to open space was key. We looked at neighborhood improvement areas, priority investment areas, income levels. And then we at some point said we need to start bringing all of this together in a kind of parametric model where we called out the neighborhoods in stress, where we said, well, these are parking lots that are in neighborhoods that are in stress because of multiple factors that are applying here. And yes, I was from Toronto Core, or the Department of Transportation. I did receive the usage data. That is absolutely key. So we need to understand how and when are these parking lots used. And if we see that there is maybe only usage primarily on weekdays, is there an opportunity for us to understand the space differently on the weekend, for example, or during rush hour times, etc. So we looked at this, and if it was always as 85% percentage capacity, could there be the possibility to at least dedicate a part of the parking lot to another usage? So I started this ranking. This is just the way how we graphically called this out. When we had these priority pilot sites, we started to call them out graphically and also related them to topology. In relationship to the transit hubs, we speculated, obviously, and said, well, there's a lot of parking around some of these transit hubs. What's happening when we start stacking these parking levels on top of each other? I understand that is real estate investment. But all of these spaces could then be used as park spaces. And maybe the parking garage is multifunctional, like Herzog and de Moran's parking garage in Florida. And it could serve also as a place for community events, etc. So the big question is, what is a parking lot? How can a parking lot be more than just parking? I don't even know where this site is. It's by Alex McLean, a photographer who photographed the United States from above as aerial photographies. But I really like this photograph because it simply overlays two functions into the same surface, not even costing anything, because the graphics that lives on a paved area is probably not the most expensive part of the project. In this case, how could a parking lot also be simultaneously maybe used for basketball courts and games and playing? And then with more investment, obviously, how can a parking lot become a parking garage with more parking? A neighborhood community parking, for example, here in Calgary, and then on top, it hosts open spaces, in this case, a sport field. And then maybe also to call out that not all of this always needs to be very expensive. This is a project by Teresa Gali, a former colleague of mine, the chair of landscape architecture at UVA, who's now she's originally from Spain and is now in Switzerland. And she presented one day one of her projects. It's a parking lot in Caracas where the capital investment was really low, according to her presentation, and where the place also needed playgrounds and sports fields. And she, as a landscape architect, also challenged the paved surface. And with very, let's say, low costs in surface design, she was able to generate a really fascinating project that now serves multiple stakeholders and is also paying attention to ecology, runoff water, heat island effects, etc. So I want to bring you quickly into some of these ideas that we generated. So please know this is student work. For me, more important is the way how we designed this as a strategy and as a method. These GIS maps are also now the data is from 5 years ago. If I had another grant, I would certainly organize it as a dashboard where GIS data are flying in and are always the latest update of GIS files, specifically the usage data. So for me, it's more important to present the method than the very specific site. I'm just guiding you now through a couple of examples. So this is a gym, again, looking at schools that had a lot of afternoon school programs, maybe didn't have enough space to host them, maybe were located next to churches where we expected potentials for collaboration. So we just called out some of these potential pilot projects. We invested into surface strategies, how the edges would be framed, how objects can activate these spaces, either as temporary placed objects or as permanently placed objects. Maybe looking a little bit how Aldo van Eyck worked on the playgrounds in Amsterdam after the war and activated 250 sites, I think, as a single designer through a design manual. We then zoomed into some of these sites, and you can always see on the right how the students imagined the surface design. I also asked them, please also think about what's happening there in the winter, what's happening on Sunday, on Monday, when parking did take place. So the time-based idea was a huge part of the project. And for sure, these projects do exist somewhere else, maybe already. Not very often, but you can find some of the projects. This is the playing park in Berlin, where the rubber surface was a playground, but also served as a parking lot. The sponge, as you know, is a critical aspect because we have more and more water runoff and heavy rain events, what we could just witness last summer in Toronto, when during a heavy extreme weather event, everything was flooded. So these appearances will happen more frequently and will maybe become a new norm or are clearly a new climate reality. So we were looking at where's the water flowing, where's a lot of flooding at the moment, and specifically since water drains down to the lake, where are currently maybe parking lots located that are sitting on areas where the water wants to run down, and how we can start cleaning the water, maybe through constructed wetlands, etc., on its way down to the waterfront. These examples also exist. This is a project in Japan and one in Australia, where green infrastructure as well as permeable surfaces are interlocked with parking areas, which allow for these sites to operate in an ecological way. The lawn for sure is a challenge. Again, these are a couple of examples. We know, depending on climate, that is maybe not so easily done when you have a long winter season, a lot of rain, but it is very worth looking into these strategies. And we also wanted to enjoy our design exercise and I very provocatively said, well, who's going to dare parking on a flower field? Probably nobody, because we would see what this site could be. So there was also a lot about working with the idea of allowing sites to being more connected to their original ground and soil. The boulevard was something that we applied primarily in the outskirts, where we have a lot of mall sites, and where we discovered that the mall, that is very often social infrastructure and also commercial infrastructure for people living there, was really hard to be accessed as a pedestrian, even if I lived very close by. So the idea of this being penetrated, these parking lots being penetrated by public space pockets and boulevards that connected the mall to the neighboring environments was very important. And here again, always working with a design manual to be able to apply this to similar sites. And that maybe comes closest to what also happened with Plaza POPs, though that was not only meant to be temporary, but actually something that could be permanently implemented to upgrade these sites. The plaza is an interesting typology, because what do you need to have a plaza? You actually have a plaza when people can start looking at the activity that's happening on a site. So here we primarily invested at the edges of the parking lots, and knowing that the parking lot at any moment could be locked off for an event, and then you automatically have the idea of seating areas, cooling areas, or shading areas through trees and public space infrastructure that you would need on these sites. The last one I want to talk before I switch over to our projects in Toronto again, the 3 precedents. The Parking Plus events, I like to sometimes work on my own assignments, and thank God I had Darcy working with me, my SRI. So we looked at the food truck events, because Toronto is a food truck city, and for sure, the food trucks stop at a lot of, somewhere on the sidewalk. They are serving a large group of the population during the lunchtime and evening time. So food truck culture is a big aspect of Toronto's everyday culture. And we were looking at where these food truck clusterings are happening. And is there something that we can do to maybe allow these sites, and specifically the parking lots again, to be used for it on a temporary basis, but also maybe to use this as a way of showing that the space wants to be something else. I was at this time traveling in Mexico, and I found this food truck village, which was super fascinating. All my friends were hanging out at the beach, and I was documenting this site because it was a very beautiful vernacular typology that operated in a very specific way to allow for flexibility of food trucks coming in and out. There were seating areas, shading areas. There was some permanent infrastructure like bathrooms. There was also a kitchen that people used to cook food. So it was very fascinating to document the site. And I started to extract this, again, this working with Darcy, extract the components that are typological and therefore could be repeated across other sites. Maybe, addressing it to other climate zones, having the solar roof maybe for cooling, but also for energy production, etc. So the idea of having specific forms of infrastructure on site to frame it as a place that is connected to the neighborhood were important aspects that we called out there. And then when we were looking at what is our favorite place for a food truck plaza, we looked at Worsley's parking, which is next to the church. It's close to the graffiti alley. It's on Queen Street. I mean, it's my neighborhood. And when you look at this on this drawing, you see that Waterworks, we drew it. It was during the time where the fence was basically, where the site was fenced off. Today, this site is developed. There is a beautiful new residence that was erected with a food hall in the first floors. The parking lot here in the back is today a dog park, which is really amazing. This next neighboring site also has a new mid-rise tower, if you want to call it like this. So a lot happened in this neighborhood since then. But we were specifically looking and interested in who would be, and you can see this at the top, who are all the actors and stakeholders who could be a part of this food truck event space on this very specific neighborhood parking lot. And I also like to think about how can this happen in the first place. So we created a little bit of a comic. Well, how is this happening? Somebody goes to the food truck and said, well, that's really beautiful that you are here, but we also have other spaces. Food trucks, vendors can get the permit to use specific sites to for their operations. So there's a comic that walks down, and what you see here as a designers is not me. So that's actually Darcy who put herself into the narrative to show how we can start seeding ideas and starting to use these spaces differently. And over time, and we might recognize that this is of value, we maybe understand that we want to have only half of this lot being dedicated to parking, and the rest is actually much more valuable as a plaza. Or it can permanently always operate simultaneously on event days, where we start to hybridize it based on time. We also had the idea of an app that people always know when these events are taking place, because the event space basically is a wandering circus that travels to different sites. The visualization and the idea of, that these sites could have new identities. There could also be different surfaces. It would be the simplest way of, showing that these sites are actually multifunctional. That was a really beautiful exercise that we went through ourselves. And then you all know that COVID hit, and during COVID, we all learned that access to open space is absolutely crucial and very important for cities. And I remember that in the very early stages, when Trinity Bellwood was then populated, that everyone got really concerned because the population density was so high, because everyone needed to go and use some spaces. So we were invited to contribute to an urbanism after Corona symposium, and we showed some of the work that was really dedicated to these parking lots. But I also arrived during my sabbatical when the US was already completely open and Canada was still quite locked down. I was able to witness what city generated by itself during COVID. And it was really beautiful to see that many parking lots were used as outdoor gyms, as food truck sites because restaurants were still closed. And COVID, to some degree, created a fracture in our way how business as usual is operating. And I believe the city showed us, at least started to show us, that there are great new ways of how we can think these spaces. I did a lot of documentation, whatever I could capture, where I saw activities happening on parking lots. I documented this. And I think the most impressive one was actually not a city-owned parking lot. It was a parking lot that was related to a workshop, a garage. And next door, there was a music shop that also had drumming lessons. And because they couldn't be indoors, they worked together with the owner of the workshop. And all of these lessons were now taking place in the public space. And people started to aggregate. They were listening to these concerts. I went there, I think it was on Fridays. I always went there and had a look at these beautiful concerts, which I think a lot of Latin American cities are doing this, where when the Samba drumming school is done with their learning, they go out into the city, they drum and make music, they end at some point on a public space where there's also food and dancing. So there's something really beautiful about having music out in the city. And what was here so amazing was it emerged really from the bottom up, which was really fascinating. So this is a work on the parking lots. Again, some of it is speculative, some of them I believe are easily done. What would cities need? I conducted, in the context of my book, I conducted a lot of interviews with other cities and their planning departments. I was specifically intrigued by what's happening in Vienna. There is a program that is now more than 20 years old that is called Einfach Mehrfach. And Einfach Mehrfach means using public spaces in multiple ways. And they generated a new palette of public space strategies that cause that, for example, today, every public school that is built in Vienna needs to have these schoolyards open to the general public in the afternoon. So they are now designed in this way to accommodate different stakeholder groups. Jutta Kleodorfer also said it's really important that cities understand that the needs or the activities in public space really change, specifically when you have dynamic demographics, new people coming in, age groups, climate change, and that it's really important to look at how we need to regenerate our idea maybe about public space. So I was very fascinated by her work. She initiated the program, Einfach Mehrfach. The feedback of everyone who was involved at the end was, it's very complicated to do this. It always sounds very easily done, but it's very complicated and complex, but it is very important that cities are looking into it, which is also very, very rewarding. So I want to now come to Toronto's 3 case studies that I'm working on in the context of my fellowship. I want to just also let you know that I'm in the middle of this work. I generated an analytical method. I was in contact with all of the initiators of these projects, the Stack Market, the Bentway, as well as Plaza POPs. I find they are very intriguing and interesting precedents that could also help other cities to do a really good job. I'm very intrigued by these projects because they all have a curatorial aspect where basically programming is changing all the time, and these spaces are intentionally diverse and always in flux. And I find this a very interesting strategy, and I'm very interested to learn from the curatorial teams. Maybe once more to talk about what cultural commons are. I think that obviously because I titled the project, my presentation today, under this subtitle, it's really something that goes into ownership, that it's co-owned even, I mean, if it's city-owned, that out of my perspective, that is already co-owned, that it's accessible for everyone, that it's developed through community engagement, that people can participate in making and creating these places, that it's also addressing sustainability. I just have now remaining 6 slides. I know that I'm nearly at the end of my presentation. I just want to quickly guide you through these sites. The Bentway is fascinating for me. I'm living close by. I'm walking there nearly on a daily basis when I'm in Toronto. It was, from the beginning, a public-private collaboration, Ken Greenberg being one of the really most important drivers of the project. It has a curatorial team. It's dedicated. It's a public space conservancy. It's non-profit organization. It's really addressing sustainability, community engagement on all fronts. COVID happened in between, so that created, obviously, for all of the 3 projects, actually, there were programming that affected the programming for sure. But it's also interesting to see that all of these projects emerged more or less in a similar time. I'm very interested to learn, specifically when I conduct the interview with the city, what needed to be accommodated for to make these projects happen. They are not standalone projects in the sense of there are a lot of projects in other cities that program the spaces under operating highways. But I think the Bentway is unique in the way how it's organized and how it's curated. So the 3 projects will not be compared with each other. This is apple, oranges, and bananas, or strawberries. But I'm intending to compare them with their siblings and cousins in other cities. I generated, for sure, I'm conducting a spatial analysis with a series of mappings that really look at how the Bentway becomes a connector, north, south, east, west, but also through bringing stakeholders on site and connecting across the city and even beyond. I have a professional photographer who also looks at these sites during event spaces when it is programmed, and during the times when it's not programmed and becomes an everyday space. I'm looking at the secondary architecture. So what are all the furniture components that help to support the activities on site? Then the stacked market, really initiated and founded by Matt Rubinoff. It's actually closer to the place where I live, so I'm very often there. I was super excited to see that this city-owned brownfield was then activated, and originally it was really meant to be temporary. It's quite successful. It is, however, an open space and a cultural space for sure, but it is also commercially operating. There's rent paid, and in order to pay for the rent, the site needs to also generate a budget. What I really like about this beautiful project is that the container in itself is a small grain parcel. It's actually the vernacular of all of our beautiful streets, Queen Street and North, where small parcels are contributing to a beautiful vibrancy and diversity in the public space. This space is also rented out and has a brewery at the edge. On the photograph, you can see here at the end of in the corner, there is now also a new housing project that is built. So all of this is really in flux. And again, the site is more or less always different when you come by. It also has times when it's closed because it is, in this sense, privately operated. And then the other one is Plaza POPs. That is a project of a very different nature, where Daniel Rostein, Naziza Nasrin, as well as Brandon Stewart, who I all engaged with when I was there in the summer. This is a project I find very fascinating. It operates actually at the northern outskirts of the city, activating all of these neighborhoods that are very much dominated maybe through the malls, but also very vernacular malls that have a really rich and diverse offer of commercial units, also as a small grain, but that have a lot of open spaces in form of parking lots. These are privately owned parking lots. And the team activated these projects through a series of grants in collaboration with the city to become temporary public spaces and to also host community events. It's very much community driven with ambassadors who are helping to water the plants. These sites heat up tremendously in the summer, and there was vegetation that came to the site, but it's all supported by young people who live around it, also creating a strong model of stewardship. I visited the site multiple times, but it's also something that actually is a wandering circus that is located along the Lawrence Avenue, but then occupied multiple sites over the time. And I'm very, very intrigued to finally conduct the analysis and to have the interview with the directorial team to learn about what needs to be facilitated for sure. When there is always this problem with when I take parking away, I'm afraid that maybe people don't come. and go shopping, but we also all know that these activation, public space activation, actually bring customers to the site. So there was a lot of networking that happened also with shop owners around these sites. And I'm intending, and I know that Brandon has a student who already worked on it, looking at the networking actor network diagram, who was actually working with whom to make these projects happen. So I have this analytical method for these three precedents. I'm very interested to look at the process and the implementation model, the organizational structure and funding, the curatorial concept and collaboration network, for sure the spatial typology and the setting, the potential for replication, and that's going to be a very interesting chapter because I conducted interviews with other specifically stack market sites. There's one proxy in San Francisco. And I remember that they said, you can't repeat this. That is a highly curated project, right? Very much generated locally through stakeholders. But there are elements that cities can do, zoning code specifically, to facilitate that these kinds of projects can happen easier. So I'm also really interested in these forms of replications. I will conduct expert interviews specifically with the curatorial teams, but also with the city, photo documentation, and the typological peer comparison. These sites are prototypes in itself, but they are also prototyping themselves again and again because they are testing these programs. So I'm very interested to learn about this. And that's the last slide. I showed originally the paved parking lot and nature coming back through. So that is the staging grounds currently presented at the Bentway on the last sequence before field operation is going to work on the next one, by Agency and Sheep, as well as Neil Donnelly and Logan McDonald. And I'm really impressed by this project because it really takes on art education and access to a site to understand what the ecological context is now that the Bentway sits on top of it. So we are tiptoeing through this landscape that was originally something else. We are learning about it. It's engaging with art, but it's also taking the water from the expressway, draining it down, monitoring the water quality, looking how native species can live or not live with this kind of pollution. And if I understood this correctly, it is also meant to be a prototype. So if these strategies are successful, they might be implemented further down the bands of the Bentway. And with this, that was the last slide. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks very much, Mona. We'll go to the question period now, and we might go a few minutes over. Sorry if you have to leave right now. So I know there's some questions in the chat, but there's a lot there, and it is hard to find them. So if you have a question, it's probably best if you can just raise your hand, and then we'll unmute you so that you can ask your question.
Do you want me to maybe switch off the share so that we can see each other, or?
It's up to you. It depends. Sometimes people have questions about parts of the presentation.
Okay, good. Then I leave it as it is.
So, yeah, I see Sam's hand is up. Sam, would you like to go ahead?
Oh, hey. Thank you so much for this presentation. It's really awesome and so cool to see all of this great work together. To get right to it, I'd asked a question in the chat. It's lost up there, but about the value prospect of all of these improvements. I think we all agree here that this is important and valuable, but in order to address things like maintenance and upkeep and funding, we need to be able to harness that value. And that's where I find things get very sticky. Do you have any thoughts? Does this come into your analysis at all?
Yeah.
How do you quantify that?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. Thank you so much. And I know that that is very important, specifically when budgets are dedicated. So one example that I can give you is I worked during 1 year with Trust for Public Lands in the United States that have a program. It's called the Community Schoolyards. And they are converting the paved schoolyards of public schools into shared spaces that are shared with the community that lives around it and the school. And the kids are actually designing these sites through a kit of part approach. They learn about runoff water, green infrastructure, etc. And they are also running into the same problem. How are we bringing value beyond the obvious? And this program is now set in place for 25 plus years, I think. They converted many of these schoolyards and areas specifically that have to address green space equity in neighborhoods that don't have public spaces. And in their analysis, they found multiple aspects beyond the obvious, like that heat island effects are reduced, that water quality is taken care of. They also discovered that kids that are now not on a paved surface, but are on a schoolyard that is a park, have much more capacity to actually learn. But they also learned that involving communities, specifically younger community groups, in co-design processes means further down the road that these students were strengthened in their capacity to believe that we can do something about climate change, that we can improve our environment, and that they take on these tasks later on in their lives. It has really something to do with strengthening our beliefs that we can address this. So they collect a lot of health data for sure. They collect, but also what the effects are downstream, thinking about the value of co-design projects, co-designed projects, where communities have a possibility to contribute to the future of a site. I don't know if this helps in answering the question, but it's very complex for sure. They need to look into it because they are trying to translate this also into a new zoning code, and they need to allow to couple funding. So one problem is always, where's the money coming from? The community schoolyards have a capital investment of $1 million, at least according to Danielle Denk. And they are trying to tap into funding that also comes from somewhere else, from green infrastructure, from infrastructure and public space design, etc. So having multiple stakeholders and people being interested in sites is also a potential to couple different funding sources.
Thanks, Mona. I think we might only have time for one more question. I saw a name, Lucas Key.
There, thank you so much for this presentation. Very helpful, very insightful. I want to speak a bit more on the ground level, because while design is very important when it comes to implementing things in the day-to-day, I work for a public institution, Metrolink, so I really take inspiration from what you're saying in regards to working with different community groups, with different community spaces. So I was wondering if you could possibly speak on using these spaces together in different groups, but coming from different perspectives, like a public institution was the best way that I can work with, a local community group, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Can you maybe rephrase the question? I'm not sure if I understood the question correctly.
I'm just wondering, how would you recommend working in different community groups from different organizations? Like, for example, I'm working for Metrolinks, which is, we're changing the neighborhood, we're literally designing space, we're doing construction. How can we work with the community groups better and using these available spaces to highlight them as well as support our projects? Because we are in the midst of, designing new space. So how can we better incorporate the community groups as we go through that process of construction? And obviously things take time, but yeah. I'm wondering how we can work with them better in the meantime.
Yeah. So what I learned from other cities, and now I'm bringing in Vienna also because I lived in Vienna for many, many, many years. What is really healthy or helpful in these contexts is when cities start to nurture their middle grounds. So the middle ground is, we have on the one hand side, top-down planning, obviously, that is necessary. There are planning departments, there are interests that come from a top, maybe even from the province, etc. And then there's community do-it-yourself. But in the middle, there is what we call middle ground. And the middle ground is where in Vienna, for example, they initiated during the 1970s neighborhood offices. And these are interdisciplinary offices, and they connect the needs of the neighborhood with the city planning and, in this case, for example, Metrolinks. That is a long-time investment in Vienna that exists now for 55 years. It caused that Vienna has the lowest rate of gentrification, which is in Europe, which is probably then also, has even more significance in America, I think. So the middle ground is very important, and it is very verse. When I interviewed Jutta Kledorfer, she said she is working with the middle ground, with all the institutions also that are basically stakeholders that are not just a loose combination of neighbors maybe, but they are on site. And that's the reason why I showed the Queen Street side, because there was a church, there is maybe a school around the corner. So working with stakeholders who already represent a larger community. that is also a way of starting discussion and starting to bring together stakeholders. So I always call them the key players that are already representing communities. I don't know if you're now at the moment referring to a very specific parking lot where you now consider, oh, maybe we can integrate some open spaces or we can integrate green infrastructure, etc. So working with these organizing workshops, but specifically starting very much from the beginning to work together with stakeholders who are representing communities through their organizational structure. I hope this
So
does
much.
it answer your
Really
question?
appreciate it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Mona. And thank you for everyone for taking part in attending today's Knowledge Cafe session. Our next Knowledge Cafe will be featuring a team led by U of T's Jay Shaw on February 19th. So Austin put a link in the chat for that, and you can click on that to see more details about it and join us next time. So thanks so much, everybody, and have a great rest of the day and rest of the week.
Thank you, everyone.